I think a lot of artists don't realise there's funding for different levels, and their bigger funds are up to £15,000. I ended up becoming a marker for PRS for music. It means I can look at other funding applications for other people. This is what I can tell you that works. You got to remember how many funding applications you might be looking at. When you're reading so many of them as well, it's like, well, you need to be getting your point across.
What do you think like 90% of funding applications are missing?
Well, 90% of them are missing. You're actively making it so I won't like put you forward for the money.
Hello and welcome back to Sound Advice. This week I'm joined by Grace Goodwin. So in this episode we're going to talk a little bit about getting funding, and you've got a bit of a background in like terms of funding applications. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I've been a musician myself for a lot of years, and I never actually really applied for any funding. It's only recently I do a lot of mentoring and work with younger artists who are sort of getting on in their careers, like wanting to sort of develop themselves, and I ended up becoming a marker for PRS for music, which is basically one of the biggest funding models that we've got in the UK for emerging and more established musicians. It's one of probably the biggest amounts of money you can probably get given in the best way. So I started marking for them, and then I think doing that, it means I can look at other funding applications for other people and sort of understand where they're going wrong and be that objective eye in a way now. Yeah,
because I mean there's a lot of you do the marking for PRS applications, but there's a lot of similarities in the forms and stuff with different funds, aren't there?
It's not even that the similarities, it's knowing how to play the game, which sounds unhinged to say, but it's understanding what they're actually asking you. Because it's like, is the question actually asking what you want it to, or are they asking something that you're not really getting and understanding? And that's where I think the objective third person of me coming in and helping can be really useful.
So when do you think artists should sort of start looking at going in for funding and applying?
It's a weird question because it depends on what level you're at, because I think a lot of artists don't realise there's funding for different levels. Like youth music is great. That's for people between the ages of I think 16 and 25. And that can be quite emerging artists, because obviously if you're between 16 and 25, you may not have established a career yet. And they do some really good funding models for like recording and release. And then there's help musicians, which is a bit more generic funding for any age group. And you can get that very early on, or you can use that when you've been a bit more established. And then I think PRS is probably the easiest to understand in terms of progression, because they have the mini accelerator funds, which in some cases are city specific, like there's a Liverpool one, and there's ones for other places around the UK that need that sort of funding injection. But then you have like Momentum and Women Make Music, and their bigger funds are up to £15,000. So that's obviously a much bigger amount, and that's when you're more established and you make a case for why we should invest £15,000 into your project.
Yeah. So there's not, because I think I've seen a lot of misconceptions about like you need X amount of Spotify monthly listeners or like Instagram followers and stuff. That's not something you'd buy into.
No, like when people apply for things like this, you obviously get the social links and you listen to this stuff, but I think we look at where you are, what you've done, and what you want to do next, which sounds like the most basic thing to say, but I will look at like the followers on like your Instagram and think, does this match the trajectory of where you want to be and what you're telling me you're doing? Because if you're telling me that you're selling out arenas, not that anyone's ever done this, and you've only got 3,000 followers, I'd be a bit like, well, the math isn't math on there. Whereas I think if you see that someone's got a substantial following, they've got a lot of engagement, they're actively gigging, it just looking at the socials backs up what they're telling you, or looking at their Spotify as well and seeing their plays and seeing where they're popular and stuff. It can help to justify the funding a little bit, especially if they haven't articulated it as well in their own application.
What kind of things do artists that you've like worked with tend to use funding for? Like what are they applying for it for?
I mean, the majority is, I want to make this album. That is the basic of it, or I want to release this single. And then you get the odd outlier of someone who wants to do like a really interesting, very out there creative project as well, or want to do a collaboration project. But the majority is, I want to make music, and because of the way the music industry works, I can't just fully fund this myself, so I need that cash injection. And that's the basics of most of it.
It sort of be like an alternative to getting like an advance on a record deal in a way.
Essentially, yeah. And it's funny because you're even seeing with some funding applications, like people who are already signed to labels saying,
really?
like, yeah, it's quite common now for them to be like, oh, well, my label doesn't cover this part of the release. Like, they may cover the recording, but I want to apply for touring costs because my label, because a lot of people sign like mini labels, don't they, like indies or like quite small little concerns. And then obviously they don't have the big budgets to be sending you out, and obviously everything's so much more expensive now than it used to be, especially touring. So I think a lot of people now are getting the cash injection. Like, I've helped people who have been signed do applications, and it's crazy to think this person's signed to a label and yet they're still needing the cash injection of foundations and charities and stuff.
Yeah, I guess that's just how it works now, though, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's just because the model is so precarious anyway now with everything, and the way you earn your money it's how do I even describe it? It's just a bit like it's uncertain. That's probably the best term to use now, is uncertain then. So it's just become a lot more common. I think you can't get by on just your own money. I think there's people obviously from more middle class backgrounds who can maybe get cash injections from family, friends, things like that, or may have the connections to do things for cheaper. But for a lot of people, if they want to work with at a certain level, they need money to do that.
What you mentioned sort of part of it. What are the different sort of eligibility requirements of these funding applications? Because there can be quite a lot of different sort of categories and stuff.
So with the PRS ones, with the Momentum Accelerator, that's £5,000, and there's a Liverpool City region specific one. There's ones for other places, I haven't marked them. So the basic is you have to be in the Liverpool City region and a musician. That's the basics of it.
That's it.
And you can apply for up to £5,000, because this is a big problem. A lot of people think this funding's not for me, and it's then me convincing people, why is this not for you? It's that sort of confidence issue.
Is that a common problem then, that people just don't really
they just look at things and go, oh, this isn't for me. And I'm like, well, why isn't it? What are you going to lose from putting in an application? The worst they're going to do is reject it. And then you've written a funding application, which you could then maybe rehash for something else. Or we go, okay, well, if they've decided that you're maybe not at that level, because you can get feedback for these things as well, we can look at it and go, okay, well, do we think maybe we need to go down a rung or two and look at where you are? Or what do we need to do to get you to the level where you probably be a viable funding application?
Yeah. Are there artists that shouldn't apply for funding, if that makes sense?
I think if you're, like, you haven't ever released a single, you have no followers, you have no fans, you've never done a gig, I think you're putting yourself in a hard position. But then I do understand there's people who are, like, maybe bedroom producers and stuff who want to make it a more professional activity, and they're like, well, I need money to do this. So it can be a double-edged sword, really, of like, you need to have established yourself a little bit and have done something, because you've got to remember, if these people are giving you money to do something, you need to follow through. So they would like evidence that you have already followed through yourself on things, even if it's something small, like a single release that was really good.
Yeah. Well, especially because these are usually grants, which they're not going to get paid back. So if they are going to invest it, they're going to want to see like the benefit of what they've done. Because I mean, you mentioned that a lot of them are foundations and charities, so that's like obviously a really important part of it. So what does, as someone who marks funding applications, what does like a typical funding application look like? Like, what are the different sections that you usually have to do? Maybe we could start with like the PRS one, but
yeah, well, it's completely different for every funding. So we'd be here for hours going through them all the different ones. But it's basically like, here's an introduction to me. Here's what I've done so far. Here's a testimony from maybe someone I know to back up what I've said, maybe like a manager, someone you've worked with, a producer. Here's what I want to do with your money. Here's my budget. It's as simple as that. That's obviously in very simple terms. It's more specific, but that's the general overview of how it works.
So if we start getting in some of the different sections, I think there's not going to be a funding application in the world that doesn't require a biography of some kind.
Yes.
So what do you think like goes into like a gripping biography?
Make it short and sweet, because I'm even guilty of this. I realise my biography was like a wind and history of my life. Like, I was born and I was like, you don't need this. It's like, you got to remember how many funding applications you might be looking at. Sometimes I'm looking at 30 or 40. I've been given a bulk of them, and it's like, it's not that I'm getting lazy. It's just like, when you're reading so many of them, it becomes like, oh my God, okay, this is another massive paragraph. But it's so difficult to get over what you want in a short paragraph. But try and write a longer one and then do an edit. Write all the stuff you want and then be like, what do people actually want to know? Or do I tailor my biography for this specific thing I'm applying for? Which I think is important. Don't just do the copy and paste of your biography. Yeah,
I think one thing that I find quite useful for biographies and stuff, we're doing that same method of sort of writing something longer and then making it shorter, is that's where I find using like some AI tools like maybe ChatGPT can be really useful, because I don't think they're generally very good at writing biographies and stuff. But if you want it to be like, you type in your biography and you say like, cut the fluff out, like cut anything that isn't important. It's really good at like looking at like taking out the less relevant stuff. That's something that I found quite useful with biographies for like the podcast and stuff. Yeah, you often only have a very short amount of time. Like I was looking at an example. I think it was the youth music one, and I think you had 50 words on that one.
Yeah, and some of them you have like 250 words, and some of them the worst thing it'll say characters, which you think, oh, that's loads, and then you realise 250 characters is nothing. Because you're thinking, oh, 250 words, I can get it across. So it's learning how to talk about yourself in a really interesting way in a very short amount of space, which is a nightmare. If
you like that 50 words one, I'd say that's probably like a paragraph. If you had a paragraph, say like 4 or 5 sentences, what would you be saying?
So, but like, this artist is in this genre or whatever, makes this type of music. She has been featured on Radio 1. She has performed with, or it's like, I want to know your greatest hits. What makes you sound, if this was a sales pitch, if you were selling yourself to me in an elevator of like, I want your money, what would you say? What would be your greatest hits? And it's obviously going to be different for everyone. Yeah.
So talking about just establishing who you are, but without, I think you mentioned that I was born in. I think that's a really common mistake. Is like, I don't think people need to know when you were born. I think it's
just all stupid stuff, things that you think are interesting. Does anyone else think that's interesting? And I have been guilty of this myself when I've looked back at old things and gone, no one cares.
Yeah. Do you think it's important? You mentioned like Radio 1, if you've been featured on that and stuff like that. Is it important to sort of put in those sort of, I don't want to use the word clout, but like those kind of things that give you a bit of credibility?
Well, it just helps, doesn't it? Because it gives you a touch point as well for me to look at it and go, okay, so you're sort of facing yourself in that area. You want to be that type. You want to be an artist who is featured on Radio 1, and that's probably different to someone who wants to be on Radio 2 or 6. It's like, it's sort of that cultural touch point of me sort of understanding who you are. And if you've supported this artist on tour, or you've played at these venues or done these type of nights, it sort of positions you a little bit and where you want to be for me to understand it a little bit more as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So moving on from biographies, another common aspect that you have to fill in the funding application is a budget. So where do you really even get started with a budget?
So I think a budget is where everyone falls foul. Most people have a really bad time with the budget. It's like they just make numbers up out the air, and I'm like, if I look at a funding application and you're wanting £15,000, for example, and you're spending 11 grand of that on PR, and I'm like, what else is the money going on? It just doesn't look good. It's like, well, why would you spend this much? It's like, and then they don't justify it, because you say how much you want to spend, and there's a little section that says like, break down your costs, and then some people will just put in PR. And I'm like,
what's that?
I'm like, well, what does that mean? Are you going to like do a promo tour around like rough trade record stores? Are you going to do in-house events? What are you going to do? Like, are you going to do interviews with these magazines? And it's like, if you don't justify your costs, it becomes difficult for us to justify it with everything. So I'm a real stickler for getting your budget right and being reasonable, like looking at it and go, is this a reasonable figure? Because some people have the fear of like, they will just think, well, the £15,000 there, so I need to ask for it all. But you can ask for 13,265. And if a budget's that more specific, I think you've probably spent more time on it. You've probably actually gone through your figures. And it's making up, you can sort of tell when someone's made up figures. They've gone, well, I think this is going to cost this. It's like, well, what's the harm in you ringing up or emailing that producer's team and asking, what would it cost for me to do X many days in the studio, and then write that down based on their fee.
Yeah, is like things coming in as like round numbers a bit of a red flag?
But not even round numbers, because sometimes that you have round numbers, but if someone's like £15,000 exactly, I'll go back and go, okay, well, where are these costs coming from? So it's not exactly the round numbers problem, but you do sort of notice that and go, have they actually put the effort in to write this, or have they just sort of freaked out? Because I think a lot of musicians, when they look at that, they'll go, oh, I'll just put in numbers, they're not going to go through it. And it's like, maybe I'm just the stickler, but I will look at these budgets and go, well, I don't really get where you're coming from with these figures, or I don't know how you're justifying that figure to me for what you want to do. And sometimes the budget doesn't match what you've asked, what you're saying, and all the written stuff. It's like, okay, well, where's this figure come from for this money? And so it's like matching up the two things, because I think people see the budget as an afterthought, but it is relevant. But the good thing is you can be a bit more forgiving, because we're not expecting musicians to be mathematicians as well. So we can be, it's when you market it, you are more forgiving of a budget. But if it's a glaring red flag, you will be like, do we have to raise this? and talk about this as an issue.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I wouldn't have thought of this before, but I think a lot of people, and myself included, when looking at sort of funding stuff, would think, so the budget is 1,500, and then you start from there. But do you think it's probably better to start with what you need? Like what you want to spend?
I mean, it's great if there's, say it's the £15,000 or whatever. You don't need to go in for 15,000 for certain funds. It's like, okay, well, I only need 7,300 to make this happen. Then maybe you might apply for 8,000 because you may have like overheads and you want a bit of wiggle room in case things go wrong. But it's looking, what do I need and what am I applying for? Because there's no point in applying for £15,000 where £5,000 of it is unaccounted for. Because it's like, is that a good use of everyone's time and money to be giving you that? If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as someone like PRS might be concerned, if you don't account for £5,000, you might just be going on holiday or something. You know, like,
it's not even that. I just think it just looks a bit lazy. So I think you're best going, what do I need? What does it cost? Let me ask for that. Which sounds like a really basic piece of advice, but I think a lot of artists are just like, blind panic about writing a budget.
Yeah, I mean, I can really see the like 500 PR thing, because that's the kind of thing that you probably like when you like strategizing in your head, you probably think of, but not like, that's not what someone who's marking a funding application is going to be looking for. They're going to be looking for something that's a lot more specific. Do you have any examples when you've like the really bad budgets that you've come across?
I'm never going to say, because I had confidentiality of what I've seen, but it's just things like if you've got, say, I go on your Instagram and you've got 3,000 followers and like 1,000 follower listeners on Spotify, and then you're wanting like 11 grand for PR, I'd be like, is this justified? Is this really going to achieve the aims you want from it? Is this the best use of everyone's time and money? Which sometimes it isn't. So that's like the basic examples I give of sometimes, and it's just like you're walking around telling me about your project in a roundabout way, but it's like, no, just make it very clear in your application what you actually want to do. I'm releasing this album on this day. I want to do a tour at these venues because I have fans in these cities. So something as simple as that, like, and making it very clear, like treating us like we're children. I want this thing. I have done this thing, this is good. Because it's like when you're reading so many of them as well, it's like, well, you need to be getting your point across. Yeah.
No, that makes total sense. Because, it's like, there's so many that are being, it's kind of like when you're doing maths at school and you've got to show you're working, because they're seeing so many that if they see the number, they'll give you the marks. But if they see the working, then I think it makes it a lot easier.
Well, yeah, it's a bit lazy if you're just writing, like, recording. And it's like, well, how many days are you doing? Have you got a producer? And it's good when you see the names of someone they want to work with or a company, because I'm like, okay, well, clearly you have researched. You haven't just gone, yeah, we're going to record. This is a vibes-based thing. We're submitting where we've actually not organised anything. It's like, oh, it's great to know that you've actually put the time and the effort into. I want to work with a producer on this studio. I want to spend 3 days doing this. It's going to cost this. And then the mixing and mastering will be with this person. It'll cost this. Okay, great. You've justified it to me. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Another aspect that kind of falls under the budget a little bit is, but sometimes you're asked to do like a marketing plan and like strategize that kind of thing. Where do you sort of start with that?
There's no one route. I think it's so different for every artist, because like, some artists who are willing to like do stuff on TikTok, and then other artists who are like, I hate social media. I want to focus more on like legacy. Like I want to go get myself in more print magazines or online blogs. I want to do this type of project. This really interesting. Like, great. Like a girl made a beer. She wasn't using the money for that, but there was someone in a funding application. It wasn't for something else, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm making like a beer." And it has like my contact details on the QR code linked to my song that I'm giving out at events. And I was like, see, that's interesting and a bit fun. So people do weird stuff like that as well. So marketing can be as basic as, I want to go to these places, I want to be on these shows and talk about these things. But it can be like really interesting, weird niche stuff as well. Like I want to send, there was one girl I vaguely remember that was really interesting. Her album was about like being heartbroken or something. And she was going to write like heartbreak letters to people. And something, but it was just a really interesting and weird sort of marketing campaign that was cool. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you just have to, like, once again, justify it and show that you've actually made a bit of an effort. Yeah.
I mean, do you think those kind of niche things can be, like, really important? I remember I was I was listening to a band, I think it was Arcs, who were doing a talk, and they were talking about how they did, I can't remember what they did now, but they did like some really weird, wacky merch items.
See, that's
that,
great.
Really helped them out.
I think that's a really good example of just show that you've thought about what you are. You're not just doing the template of, I release single, I make merch, I do tour. Yeah. It's like, okay, well that's great. That's how most people do it. But what are you doing that's specific to you? Which I think a lot of people can forget.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's definitely different for every artist, but I think one of the problems a lot of people have with a marketing plan is that they probably haven't really like spent money on marketing before. Like a lot of artists have mostly just done like social media stuff and like maybe like magazines and press and stuff for people they know and meet. But like how, if like you're navigating doing paid marketing in an application like this for the first time, where should like most artists start?
I don't think it's paid marketing. It can be like the stuff you mentioned, like the getting on blogs, magazines, things like that. That's all marketing. And I think a lot of artists that you see at the levels we're looking at, it'll be on like merch or some like interesting sort of thing they want to do for maybe a viral video or something like that. And so it's very artist specific. It's not like this is what I can tell you that works sort of thing, because marketing is so specific to the artist. Like maybe a folk artist might not want to be on TikTok doing a dance, but then maybe like a pop artist would be into that. And obviously that's quite a generic example, but it's not the one size fits all approach, which would be great if it worked for everyone, but it's very artist specific, I think, in many ways, of what they're willing to give out and what they want to keep to themselves. It's very different.
How do you, obviously you get there's a lot of competition for all of these funds, right? I mean, you mentioned that you mark, was it 30 to 40 of like the PRS ones? How many applications like come through on a fund like that generally? I
don't know, because I'm not involved in any of that side of it. I just the way it works with my marking is I just get sent stuff and I mark it and send it back, and then sometimes I'll then be on a panel where we decide who gets the money, or that will go to another panel and I won't hear about it again, and then I'll see in a few months' time who's got the money. So there's different levels to it, and it's I think it's good to be removed from that way. I don't know who's coming in. I don't know much about them. I never see a funding application from someone I know. I reject it because obviously it's not fair for me to mark an application from someone I know.
Is that like you send it to someone else to mark it, or do you just flat out say no?
Basically, more than one person marks it, because I think obviously music is so subjective because we're listening to the music as well. So it can't just be one person marking it. So I might submit it and give the music a 7 out of 10, and then someone might submit it and give a 10, and then it goes. I don't know how they work it all out, but multiple people will have marked these applications on music and the application, and then it goes back to the team, and then they do some magical working out that leads to a shortlist, and then a panel decides on the shortlist.
You mentioned the music side of it. I think it'd be really interesting to know, because there's so many different ways that you can send music and so many different like options for like links to share music and stuff. Do you have like a favourite?
The majority of people use Spotify or YouTube links, and then if it's unreleased stuff, SoundCloud. So make sure your links work. Honestly, there's been applications I've got when it's been a broken link, or it's been like, you cannot access this as a private link. And I'm like, you had one job, just put in the right link, because it's like, you're actively making it so I won't like put you forward for the money sort of thing, because if I can't listen to the music, I can't justify giving this a mark, which can be, it's really frustrating. So that's a really big thing to make sure that you're getting right. And it's like, am I submitting the best of my work as well? Because some people will submit really random weird stuff, and I'll be like, is this justifying what you want to do? Or they'll send you like a folk track and be like, but I'm going to move on to electro pop now. And I'm like, well, why are you sending us a folk track? I'd rather you sent us a demo of what you want to do next, because that would make more sense, because I could actually hear where it's going, rather than you sending like a folk track that may be good, I may really like it, and I'll say that, but then I'll be like, but if you're wanting to be an electro pop artist now, this is a bit of a juxtaposition between what you're asking and what you're actually giving us.
Definitely. I mean, one thing that I do think is really important, which I've meaning to mention for a while, is like, for this and for a lot of other things, don't send WeTransfer links, because they expire.
I've never had that lucky, but I think the funding applications, like I know PRS specifically, are very much like, send it in these type of format, and I think it helped musicians and all that. The ones I've helped write like people with, they're very specific, and it's always like, come on, this is really easy to get right. Do a Spotify link, a YouTube link, or if it's unreleased, make it a SoundCloud link.
Yeah.
They just stick to them rules and you'll be fine.
Yeah, I think as well, there are other services that you can use, but I think using the things that are going to be most familiar is just going to make it...
Yeah, the most generic, like the easiest to access, because some it'll be like, you have to do this, and I'm like, how do I even get to this track? Or some people send Bandcamp as well, that's another example, but sometimes they'll send a generic Bandcamp link and then I'll have 7 tracks, and I'll be like, I don't have time to listen to 7 tracks. Like, you're meant to be showcasing what's your best stuff, rather than me. But I will do it because I feel bad, but I'll look through everything and be like, okay, well, that track I think is one of the best tracks, so I'll sort of use that. But it's so difficult if they're just sending you everything rather than specific tracks.
Yeah. You mentioned that like there's a lot of competition for these funding applications. How do you, just in general, how do you sort of stand out, and like what do you think like 90% of funding applications are missing, if there is something?
Well, 90% of them are missing a strong budget, which is always a must, because I think a lot of artists shy away from it. I hate this, that it's like nigh impossible for me to tell you what makes a good funding application. I think coherency, a good budget, making it very simple and very clear. This is what I've done, this is what I want, and this is what it's going to achieve, and this is what's going to happen next. Because we want to, it's like you want to show, well, if they invest the money in you, you're going to go on to do some cool stuff. And I think PRS Foundation, if you look at what the artists they've funded over the years, including like Little Sims and stuff like that, artists have gone on to be incredibly successful. They have a good hit rate of working with people who go on to do really cool stuff at the early stages of their career.
Yeah.
So that's really important. So it's submitting your best music, and like it's a sales pitch essentially at the end of the day, but a well-written one.
Yeah.
So I hate that I've given you not the best advice there.
I
just hate that I can't say like,
of course,
you do this thing and it works really well. Because it's sometimes I'll be listening to a folk artist, then I'll listen to some grime music, then I'll get like a heavy metal track, and it's like it's so different, it's so broad, and that makes it so hard to mark as well.
Yeah.
So I think they try and group by genre a lot of the time to make it a little bit easier. Because obviously it's impossible to mark a folk artist against like a grime artist in terms of musical ability. Because it's like both the tracks are great, so it could be really difficult. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Just to wrap up, obviously, because there's so many applications, the majority of people don't succeed the first time around.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you had sort of any advice for people who've had that first application rejected, and what they can sort of do to improve on that.
It's not the end of the world. You are one of hundreds of people who get rejected. And it's like, you may get rejected 3 or 4 more times, but it's like asking for the feedback and taking it on the chin, not being defensive about it. Because you can, I think, help musicians and all that. They can send you written feedback, or you can jump on a call with someone. And when they're talking, even though it is your personal project, was what you submitted the best? And like, retrospectively looking back and going, was I in the right position for that funding really? It's like, well, no. It's like, okay then. It's like, well, what you put in was little, but you got something out of it that you can then use again. Essentially, I think is important. Some people get rejected 6 or 7 times, and then they'll get it at the time they need it. Then it's like, okay, it's justified now. And you might know that this person's applied a few times. And it's like, okay, well, actually, they now made a very strong case, and you're like a veteran of it at that point. But yeah, it's just incredible. It can be incredibly difficult and disheartening the first time it happens. But then you just realise that rejection is just a natural part of the course. And it's never a personal thing. It's not like your music was atrocious and we hate you and we never want to hear from you again. It's like, you know what? I don't think it was the right time, which can be frustrating. Or this section was incredibly weak and you need to improve on this. And then that gives you something to work towards, which is where I sort of help artists and stuff and go, okay, well, what can we do to improve this for next time?